Hey friends, my desk is super messy, so today I'm going to make a monitor stand to clean it up. So a caveat before we get started, I'm not a woodworker or a professional of any kind. I just like to make stuff. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so first I'm going to go over all the tools that I use for this project. I broke them into 4 groups: tools that are handy, helpful, powerful, and finally tools that are aesthetic. Alright, here are the handy tools. I used a speed square and a combination square to mark and measure cuts. I used a centering dowel jig because drilling in a straight line is much harder than it looks. You could probably just make one of these, but I bought it off of Amazon. And finally, rounding off the handy tools, I used some screws for general assembly, which I'll talk about later. Alright, moving on to helpful tools. Starting things off with wood glue. I probably didn't need the screws because this stuff is plenty strong. I used these Jorgensen parallel clamps to hold things in place while the glue dried. These 36-inch ones are probably overkill for this project, but since my other clamps turned out to be too small for some of the larger holes, these were a project saver. Alright, on to power tools. These are by no means necessary, but they did make my life a lot easier. I used an orbital sander to even things out, a drill for all the dowel holes, and a jigsaw for some of those smaller cuts. Finally, I used a miter saw to chop up all the wood. Okay, aesthetic tools. I used wood filler to fill in all the gaps for my messy cuts, and tung oil to finish and protect the wood. Now let's talk a little bit about planning. Before I start building anything, I draw the intended design to make sure I have enough materials. And in this case, I'm glad I did because it turns out I was a little short. So I had to make a trip to Home Depot. Alright, we are back from Home Depot, so let's get started. Once I gathered all the materials, it was time to start cutting. I started out with 12 feet of plywood and 8 feet of redwood, which is more than I needed for this project, but it left me plenty of room for mistakes. For the design, I thought it'd be cool to have the redwood in the center and the plywood on the edges. I used dowels to connect all the pieces and pre-drilled holes, which I later filled with wood glue. I also sanded the edges so that everything would fit nicely together before I assembled everything. The top was 18 inches across, the shelf was 12, and both the sides were 6 inches. Finally, I glued everything up and used the previously mentioned parallel clamps to hold things in place while the glue dried. On to sanding. As I mentioned, I'm not the best at cutting straight, so I spent a lot of time sanding. Also, the redwood I used was a little thinner than the plywood, so I spent additional time trying to even that out. I also sanded the top and bottom of the side pieces so that the stand would be level. Okay, at this point I wanted to check and make sure that the sides were pretty level and that the top was pretty flat before I clamped everything together. And as you can see here, there's actually a pretty good bend in the sides, but fortunately it didn't matter because I just needed to make sure that they were even enough for the top to lay flat, which it did, so I was happy to move on. Alright, so the next step was to start putting everything together. I forgot to mention this in the overview, but I have these super handy 90-degree angle clamps, and I'm pretty sure this is not how you're supposed to use them, but I use them to hold these planks of wood in place while I drilled some screws in through the sides. After a quick level check, I then assembled the wings. Thank you, giant clamps. Now for the top assembly, I had to get a little creative. This required a ton of glue, and I needed to make sure it was lined up before I started clamping everything down. Finally, the last complicated piece, the parallel clamps are awesome for horizontal clamping, but they're not really meant for vertical work, so it was a bit awkward getting these things into place. Fortunately, they're pretty heavy on the bottom, so this all worked out pretty well. Once everything was all glued up and stable, it was time for more sanding. I used the orbital sander again to go over the larger pieces, and then I touched up the corners with a Rogue sanding pad. Alright, on to aesthetics. Once everything was all smooth, I went back and filled in all the gaps with some wood filler. In the sanding process, I managed to ruin the evenness of the stand, so I had to go back and add some shims on one side to fix that. Unfortunately, I didn't get any footage of that, so yeah, it's just me filling in holes for like 5 minutes. Feel free to fast forward. After I got the gaps filled in, the difference in color between the wood and the filler was pretty noticeable, so I decided to experiment with a little paint. I used these three colors to cover up the spots where I used wood filler. The match wasn't perfect, but overall I think it turned out pretty close. Here's the finished project. I think it looks super cool, uneven sides and all, and I'm super happy I made the time to work on it. Overall, not a monumental change in my desk organization, but I had a ton of fun working on it, and I learned a lot along the way. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. If you have any tips on how I could have done this better, or how I can improve this project, or how anyone else can improve this project, let me know in the comments below. Finally, if you'd like to check out more projects like this, check out this link above. Thanks, and see you in the next one.